to this question of revenue generation. So, Union Finance Minister heard the consensus very clearly, and absolutely this is an absolute requirement for the states that below, that up to from 1.5 and below, small businesses, your beauty parlor run by a woman, some small businesses of shops, they should not suffer from dual control of both center and state authorities honing on them. In other words, the inspectorate system, they should not suffer more on. States have been administering them. They will continue to administer. Was the unanimous decision of the finance minister conveyed to the union finance minister. And we have made it very clear, this is an absolute requirement for the small businesses of India. And we are certain that we will work towards this, and it will be something that the union government, Honorable Finance Minister himself heard with his own ears the words of each of the finance ministers. I'm sure this will also be resolved, because it has to be resolved in order for GST to happen.
Right. Sir, very quickly, is there a consensus now? Is there a consensus now on the bill on 1% entry tax, 1% additional entry tax? Anything on that?
It is already known that what has been absorbed in the GST is known to you. So there is nothing for me to say.
What was the resolution?
It is not a resolution today. This is something you will see in the whatever is relevant for constitutional amendment. Today's issues are constitutional amendment, in which very important were the wordings for compensation. Very important was also the fact that when money goes into the central government's pool, consolidated pool, it becomes difficult for that money to come out to the states. On that, there's a broad consensus, and hopefully that has been resolved, which will be reflected in the constitutional amendment. That's a constitutional amendment issue.
What is that?
As far as GST rate is concerned, I have already said a broad consensus has been worked out where the common man does not face the current levels of tax, so that they are better off. At the same time, the states also are able to get their revenue. Such a broad consensus has been worked out.
So what are the other constitutional amendments? So what are the other constitutional amendments?
I'm telling you, broad consensus has been worked out. You can ask me. I've already told you. मैं हिंदी में बोल दूँ. हाँ सर हिंदी में. The main issues of constitutional amendment I've already indicated to you. There is clarity on the wording, and further work will be done so that the consensus empowered committee is reflected in that. Very important in this,
Yes, sir.
which is not a part of the constitutional amendment, is the 1.5 crores. That's not a part
You
of
will control in the constitutional amendment bill, sir.
as far as constitutional amendment issues are concerned.
Oh, that will be added in the bill.
Specific, no, that's not in the constitutional amendment.
That's what I'm asking.
But that is something you cannot add in the constitutional amendment bill. It will go into the act.
GST Act.
So, as far as the wording, today's primacy was given to wording of the constitutional amendment, so that if there is a broad consensus that is understood, it will help the Union Finance Minister to move the constitutional amendment to the satisfaction of all states. अब हिंदी में बोल दूं, आज के जो मीटिंग थी, इसमें सबसे बड़ी बात ये थी कि जो कॉन्स्टिट्यूशनल अमेंडमेंट की जरूरत है, उसमें कंसेंसस निकालने की जरूरत थी. एक चीज जरूर है जो कॉन्स्टिट्यूशनल अमेंडमेंट में नहीं है, लेकिन एक्ट में आएगी या बिल में आएगी, वो ये है कि छोटे बिजनेस के लिए एक 1.5 करोड़ के नीचे, 1.5 करोड़ एंड नीचे जो लोगों के टर्नओवर है, उनके ऊपर बोथ स्टेट एंड सेंटर हावी ना हो जाए, जैसे उनके ऊपर इंस्पेक्टर राज न थोपा जाए. हर राज्यों ने एग्री किया है, कंसेंसस दिया है हमारे वित्त मंत्री को, यूनियन वित्त मंत्री को, कि इस मामले में केवल स्टेट के अधिकार रहनी चाहिए और 1.5 करोड़ के ऊपर आप ड्यूअल कंट्रोल जरूर रखिए। वो कैसे ड्यूअल कंट्रोल होगा वो भी आराम से तफसील से बैठ के उसको सिस्टम निकाला जाएगा, जो ऑलरेडी एक सिस्टम पेश है, उसके ऊपर विचार होगा। नंबर 2 नंबर विषय वो है कि स्टेट की कॉम्पेंसेशन, अगर मान लीजिए राज्यों की जो पैसा मिला, राजस्व मिला जीएसटी से, उससे उनको जितना मिल रहा था उससे कम मिला, तो कैसे स्टेट चलाएंगे? इसके ऊपर कंसेंसस हुआ। ये वर्डिंग जो पेश होगी पार्लियामेंट में, ये फुल का जो कॉम्पेंसेशन 5 साल के लिए कॉम्पेंसेशन, उसके जो वर्डिंग प्लेस होगी उसके ऊपर ही ब्रॉड कंसेंसस निकल आया, जो यूनियन गवर्नमेंट उसी के मुताबिक वो वर्डिंग तैयार करेगी। ये 2 बड़े मुद्दे थी जो कॉन्स्टिट्यूशनल इश्यूज था, और एक कॉन्स्टिट्यूशनल इश्यूज के बाहर जो है वो है 1.5 करोड़ और उसके नीचे जो आम छोटे लोग बिजनेस करते हैं, कोई ब्यूटी पार्लर चलाता है, महिला चलाती है, या कोई छोटे दुकान चलाते हैं, उनके जो रोजगार है 1.5 करोड़ टर्नओवर है, उनके ऊपर दोनों हावी नहीं होंगे। राज्य अभी उनको एडमिनिस्टर कर रहा है, राज्य एडमिनिस्टर करते रहेगी। एज फार एज तीसरी विषय है कि टैक्स क्या होगा, इसके एक प्रिंसिपल तय हो गया आज। प्रिंसिपल यह है कि आम लोगों के ऊपर टैक्स के जो इंसिडेंस आज है, राजस्व के इंसिडेंस है, उसको कम करना चाहिए, जैसे कि उनको रिलीफ मिले, नहीं तो इतनी बड़ी रिफॉर्म के क्या मतलब है। दूसरे, राज्यों के जो राजस्व आती है, जो टैक्स आती है, उसमें भी कमी ना हो, ये देखना पड़ेगा। ये दोनों मुद्दे के ऊपर एक वर्डिंग तैयार हुआ है, जो सब लोगों की, सब पार्टियों की जो बोलना है वो उस वर्डिंग में आराम से फिट हो जाती है।
1% इंटरेस्ट टैक्स पर क्या होगा? 1%?
हाँ सर, यही पूछना चाह रहे हैं सर।
कौन सी?
आरएनआर का कोई इशू क्या? आप कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन बिल की बात
नहीं, आरएनआर कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन के अंदर आप जानते हैं कि कोई कॉन्स्टिट्यूशनल अमेंडमेंट में कोई रेट नहीं जाता है, ये तो आप जानते हैं। इसके ऊपर विचार हुआ है, निष्कर्ष हुआ है, वो माननीय यूनियन फाइनेंस मिनिस्टर कम्युनिकेट कर रहे हैं बाकी पार्टियों से, वो उनको समझाएंगे। वो कॉन्स्टिट्यूशनल अमेंडमेंट में नहीं जाती है, लेकिन वो बिल में जा सकती है, वो एक्ट में जा सकती है, उसके ऊपर विचार चल रहा है। कंसेंसस उसके ऊपर यही है, कोई रेट के बजाय ये है कि प्रिंसिपल क्या है। प्रिंसिपल है आम जनता, आम बिजनेसमैन के ऊपर जो आज जो धक्का उनको मिलता है टैक्स से, हो सकता है जो ये इफेक्टिव टैक्स इतना है कि 32% भी हो सकता है, 30% हो सकता है, उसको घटाना बहुत जरूरी है, नहीं तो इतनी बड़ी रिफॉर्म करने की क्या जरूरत है। दूसरे है कि राज्यों की जो टैक्स मिलना चाहिए, जैसे कि वो आराम से अपना राज्य चला पाए, उसके ऊपर भी देखना है। ये दोनों चीज सामने रखते हुए एक वर्डिंग तैयार हुआ है, जिससे वाइड कंसेंसस सब पार्टी के है।
लेकिन सर ये जीएसटी एक्ट में जाएगा ना? जीएसटी एक्ट, हाँ।
All right, I do have 3 very special guests to take that story forward. Mr. Mohandas Pai, who represents India Inc., representing Parliament on this show. Here is Rajiv Chandrasekhar on the phone line, and of course representing the tax man and what do tax experts make of this big meeting is Satya Podar. Thanks each one of you for being with us, and because Mr. Podar is the subject matter expert on this matter, what are you making of some of what you've just heard Mr. Amit Mitra say? He is the chairman of the council. What are you making of this? There is a broad consensus on that 1.5 crore being under absolute state control. Dual control has been agreed upon. There's also a broad consensus within the state finance ministers that there can be no cap on the rate as far as the GST is concerned. They're talking about putting that cap either in the bill or the act, but not in the constitution really. There's also plenty of talk about the principle of tax being agreed upon. Mr. Podar, if you're getting to hear me here, what are you making of this meeting? Because this is advisory in nature, but these are inputs that will go into the final decision and the final draft that the government does table in the House.
I think whatever they are saying is welcome, but to me, they are staying at a very high principles level. The statements that Mr. Mitra made, if I can say so, they are like platitudes. They don't really add much substance to what is already known to the public. For example, his statement about the tax rate. Tax rate should be providing relief to the consumers. At the same time, they must protect the revenues of the state government. Now, what does it mean? It means nothing. That's the entire, any kind of a tax reform is always designed to help the taxpayer without any loss in revenues to the government. So this principle that they seem to have crafted, to me, it's shallow, it's hollow. I don't think it's going to help the cause of approval of the bill in Parliament. If Congress party, if they support, anybody else they support, they'll support on the basis of other factors. I don't think empowered committee discussions are adding much weight. The whole idea of control of the small dealers, there again, my own feeling is that one of the virtues of the GST type tax is that there is no need for physical control on the dealers. All the control that is required is through information process. And the government is designing an absolutely outstanding world-class system of information flow, matching of invoices. So if you have that system, there's nothing to fear about physical control on the dealers. Whether it's a dual or singular, it doesn't really matter which government has the control on all of these people. So the fears of the dealers, as well as all the debate and discussion that is taking place, is not really completely reflecting the new system the governments are designing for the GSTN. It's largely the old mindset.
The point well taken that the empowered committee will have little bearing if, and this is a hollow argument that is being made. But Rajiv Chandrasekhar, because you are a part of Parliament and you are seeing a whole lot of back and forth happen between the government and the opposition benches on this, which side of this argument is the empowered committee really weighing towards? And I think I'd like to throw my weight with Mr. Poddar. 1.5 crore to be under the state ambit, but you have to fully compensate the state for the first 5 years. There is a broad consensus that there shouldn't be a cap on the GST rate, which means that the Congress state FMs are also throwing their weight behind this. Is it now going to be easy for the government to convince the Congress party, because that seems to be the only thorny issue left? There is also an in-principle agreement that the dispute resolution should be decided by the GST Council. Again, contrary to this, the Congress party has been demanding it should be by an authority outside. How are you looking at all of these arguments being made and their bearing on the final constitution amendment bill?
No, I think
Mr. Chandrasekhar?
it's quite clear that the final contours of the bill are emerging from this consultation, and it will become pretty clear in the next few days as the bill is introduced and the debate commences, that all political parties now have come around to supporting the constitutional amendment, given what was just laid out. And I disagree with the previous speaker that this is shallow. I think the crux of the issue today is this concern, artificial or real, about the GST in some sense being an out-of-control cost, a very high cost on consumers. And I think that has been addressed today very specifically and head-on by saying that the GST tax regime is a moderating tax on the consumers, and it will not create a regime where consumers have to bear the burden of a high tax just in the name of taxation reform. It is quite clear now that the bill will be introduced and there will be a debate next week, and it is quite clear that the Congress is probably the only party that is not on board, and they have really one issue that they're sticking on, which is the issue of capping the GST. And that has been, in a sense, answered by saying that we will take it out of the constitutional amendment and, if necessary, bring into the GST law, into the GST Act, the issue of, how to define this being a moderate consumer-friendly tax regime, tax reform.
And And that's a fair argument that you're making, but I do want to get in Mukesh Butani as well, another tax expert who understands that issue very closely. My panel here is divided. Mr. Satya Podar believes that the arguments that have been made today are rather hollow and will not have a big bearing on the Constitution Amendment Bill. Rajiv Chandrasekhar, on the other hand, believes that this is going to have a significant role to play when that Constitution Amendment Bill does get tabled in the House, hopefully next week. What are you making of this? I know Empowered Committee's decision or its suggestions are consultative in nature, but the fact that this is giving you a sense of what the states want.
I didn't hear Mr. Podar, but I did, and I largely.
Mukesh, we can hear you. Can you carry on?
I also feel that insofar as the impact on
all right, there seems to be some trouble with Mukesh Butani's audio. If we can fix this, we'll come back to him. Can we fix that really fast, please? All right, we've got Swaminathan Iyer, our consulting editor, joining us live right here on ET Now. Swami, thank you very much for being with us. This was a big meeting of the of the Empowered Committee, and there is a broad consensus on few of the issues. If I may quickly update you with what the issue has been, and for viewers who are joining us at the top of this hour, there is a broad consensus that businesses with turnover of 1.5 crore or under that will only be regulated by the states. Anything above that, they will have to be dual control. They still have to work out the modalities. There is a broad consensus that the states will have to be compensated for revenue shortfall for a period of 5 years. There is also a broad consensus that the cap on the GST rate cannot be a part of the Constitution Amendment Bill. It can either be a part of the bill or the act at a later date or even at this stage, but not a part of the Constitution Amendment Bill. And there is also a broad consensus that the dispute resolution mechanism should be decided by the GST Council itself. It should not be left to an authority outside. So seemingly, 3 of Congress's demand, and it looks like the Empowered Committee has made up its mind on 2. I know it's consultative in nature. These cannot call the shots. But how do you think this sets the stage for the government to push through the GST? Swami?
I think it was known after the recent Rajya Sabha elections that provided Jayalalitha and somebody else, maybe Mayawati, came on board, the Congress by itself would not be able to block the passage of a constitutional amendment. I think the numbers made that clear. At this late stage, whether they have still got Jayalalitha on board fully, I don't know. If she is on board, yes, I think the constitutional amendment will go through and we will finally be set. But as you said, a constitutional amendment is only the beginning. After that, there has to be an act incorporating different features of it. All of this will take time because state legislation will be required also, as far as I can see. I wonder whether everything will be in place by April 1st next year, although that is the effort. All I can say is that the prospects have brightened, but I still say don't count your chickens before they hatch.
That is indeed the big million-dollar statement, isn't it? Prospects have brightened, but they were as bright as this the last time around also. But of course, there is more consensus, and it almost looks like it's become a part of common parlance. I also have Mohandas Pai on the phone line with us. Mr. Pai, I'm going to ask you a little tricky, controversial political question here. Does the Congress party have the moral authority to oppose the GST at this stage when there is such groundswell that's bearing up for it?
Well, I think the Congress party is essentially trying to score political points and prevent the NDA from bringing reforms because they don't want the country and the NDA to benefit from the reform before the 2019 elections. They have been obstructing this for a fairly long period of time, putting impossible conditions like putting into the Constitution. Now there's a consensus among state ministers. Now that the NDA has greater numbers in the Rajya Sabha, I hope they see the writing on the wall. And I think what has happened today is that the central government has been generous to say, we'll underwrite your losses for 5 years. We will make sure there's no extra burden on the common man because of this tax reform. And we will work with you to make sure that you are part of the whole system and we will not override the system. Essentially the same point that the states wanted when the UPA was in power, and the UPA did not want to do this. They wanted to override the states. Now I think the political issue is the Congress will get isolated because all the states' demands would have been met, and it is for the center to be generous and give in larger amounts of money. Even the fiscal deficit goes up 1%, 1.5% of the next 5 years is perfectly okay because the benefits are going to be immense. And the state, as the center has opened its purses, the Congress will be isolated in case they oppose. And I'm sure they're going to oppose it because they don't want the NDA to succeed. So we have to wait and see what happens in Parliament, whether the consensus holds.
So who better than Rajiv Chandrasekhar to throw back that question to, because he is a part of Parliament that's indeed going to build a consensus on the GST. Mr. Chandrasekhar, do you believe it's time the Congress party will blink? They had put up 3 demands, dispute resolution, 1% additional levy and cap. The government has more or less adjusted 2 of the demands, which is dispute resolution and that 1% additional levy. That will indeed be aborted. The stage is really set for that cap also to be a part of the bill or the act. Do you believe it's time the Congress party will relent on this matter? Increasingly, they look a little isolated in the House.
No, I think they've been looking isolated for quite a while. And this issue of, and this recent thing that they have put out that this is not a perfect bill, and therefore they need the cap in the constitutional amendment is a bit of a weak, to use a polite word, a very weak argument, given the history of taxation reform as an evolving, continuing process. So the GST bill and the constitutional amendment must be passed. And of course, we know that this bill and this taxation reform will continue to evolve and improve. At the very basic level, for example, both the state GST and the central GST at some point will merge into one levy, which will then be shared by the state and the center in a different way. So there is a lot of improvement that will naturally happen. And for the Congress to take a position today to say that we need the cap and this bill is imperfect is, as all of us have begun to realize, is pure politics. And I think the Empowered Committee today has called the bluff on this issue of cap by saying that there is a consensus that the GST, the levy, both the central and the state levies, will not be anti-consumer, anti-business. And it will be a moderate regime. And if there is a need to explicitly legislate for that, the GST Act will be the place to do that, rather than the constitutional amendment that only enables the passing of a GST Act. So I think the arguments that have been made by the Congress have been explained, and now the contours of the consensus, the non-Congress consensus around this constitutional amendment are becoming pretty clear and evident and address all of the concerns, real or imaginary, that the Congress have raised over the last few weeks and months.
And we indeed are keeping our fingers crossed for the GST to finally see the light of day. I've got 2 very eminent tax experts with us, Mukesh Butani and Satya Poddar. Hold your thoughts there, gentlemen, because I do want to get in, Swami, on that word about the politics over the GST, because something that Rajiv Chandrasekhar alluded to. Swami, I have a very direct question to ask of you, and I'm just being the devil's advocate. The Congress party, and I'm going to quote Mr. Chidambaram here, who actually in some way co-authored the GST bill, he is saying that indirect taxes are regressive in nature. The poor and the rich alike have to pay for those taxes. If there's ever an emergency, you can increase direct taxes, and which is why the Congress, according to him, is insisting on a cap on the GST rate. Does that argument cut any ice with you?
There is a big gap between theory and practice. I understand the theory of what Chidambaram is saying, but if you just go back to, shall we say, 1991, before the reforms, or let's go back even earlier, when Indira Gandhi imposed income tax of as much as 97.75%. Did it mean that she was able to lower all the indirect taxes and collect all the money from income tax? No, she couldn't. Because of massive evasion and the limited capacity of the state, the entire amount of income tax you collected at 97% as a percentage of GDP was less than what you're collecting today at 30%. So, the notion that in theory I will have a high rate of tax on individuals and a low rate for the indirect taxes, I understand the theory of it. In practice in India, we know that hardly anybody is paying income tax. A very tiny number, maybe 30 million people at most, are paying. So once you broaden the tax base, once you get more people to pay income tax, corporate tax incidentally has gone up from 1% of GDP to 4 to 5%, depending on which state is there. Once these rise, then the scope for reducing the indirect taxes does happen. Let me add that there are some very, very successful economies who have said, sorry, the entire theory is wrong. Ireland reduced its direct taxes. Its corporate tax came, I think, all the way down to 12%, and they increased their GST, their VAT, to 23%. And the one consequence was they got a huge amount of foreign investment, and the economy boomed. And this was done, incidentally, by a quasi-socialist government in Ireland. So the idea that, you must have very high direct taxes and very low indirect taxes, both in theory and practice, this we need to be looked at in a much more nuanced fashion. In India, until we really overhaul our tax administration and are able to get a very large number of people into the direct tax net, we will be depending on indirect taxes for a long time. And the whole point of GST is not to raise the taxes. It is supposed to be revenue neutral. The whole idea is that we are switching from one tax system to another without any net increase. So then where is the question certainly of great unfairness in putting some burden on the poor?
Just hold your thoughts there, Swami, because I do want to take this discussion away from the politics of GST to really the tax structure, so to say. And Mr. Mukesh Butani, if I may come to you, there seems to be this urgency in New Delhi to get the GST passed. And rightly so. It's been in the waiting for about 10 odd years now. It's time it sees the light of day. But the question really is there a little bit of double speak even on the part of states? And is the union government in some sense giving up a little more than it perhaps needs to? 1.5 crore and less of business is going to be governed by the states. Anything more than that, you need a dual control. Contours still have to be worked out, but there has to be full compensation for any revenue loss for 5 long years. Is the state government in its bid to get the GST through, letting go of a bigger pie than it perhaps should? Because who is going to take care of urban infrastructure? Who's going to take care of the big central schemes? It will eventually boil down to the state, to the central government and not to the states. Mr. Butani?
Well, we had always known that India is not going to have a perfect GST. And the philosophical debate is, should we have a GST which is imperfect or not have a GST? We had always known right from day one, given the constitutional structure, that it is going to be very difficult to bring alcoholic beverages and stamp duty and many other taxes within the GST framework. And now if the compromises are being made because states feel insecure that their share of revenues will dip, I think those compromises are fine. I think we've gone past that debate. The issue over here is, what are those 2-3 important issues that are left behind to ensure the safe passage? GST law is going to take time to settle down. If opponents of GST believe that a GST regime is going to bring a higher tax impact on the common man, I don't know whether that's correct, because if you look at the rate structure that has been recommended by Dr. Subramaniam Committee, over 70% of the products liable for GST are the ones that impact the common man. And the rate structure has been recommended keeping in mind those products. We need to see how the law pans out. Over a period of time, the government will always have the ability to tinker with the rates. But right now, we are now having competing objectives to meet over here. On one hand, state governments don't feel comfortable giving up their rights. On the other hand, federal government has onerous responsibility to make sure that the fiscal budgets are not impacted given its commitment towards social program and infrastructure development. But the point is that you will never be able to get to a perfect solution till the time you see how the rates pan out. To me, this debate is somewhat similar to the debate we saw in 2003 when the states were reluctant to move away from a sales tax system to VAT system. We all know between 2003 and 2006, in the first few years itself, the VAT collections of all states went up. Not even a single state stood up and said that the VAT collections have come down. Similar is the argument for GST. So I think this is a political debate. Politicians have to settle this debate, make sure that the GST bill is passed through, and then work out the mechanics only after the GST law settles down. So I completely dismiss this argument that we are trying to make competing ends meet, and there is a concern amongst the state that their revenue base will get eroded, to which I think the central government has given all the support.
Yeah, That's a valid argument you've made, but I do want to take it to Satya Podar because I'm completely running out of time here on this show, and I do want to talk to you about a specific number. I mean, yes, finance ministers after finance ministers from states, whether it was Amit Mitra or Thomas Isaac or the Himachal Pradesh finance minister, they all came out and said they still have to decide on the revenue neutral rate. Now, if the revenue neutral rate is going to be 18%, as is being suggested, or a case being made by the Subramanian Committee, will that be politically palatable is really the big question, and will that perhaps set the stage for more GST compliance? Mr. Podar?
Well, it's not a question of 18% rate alone. GST compliances will depend upon a number of factors, with compliance procedures as well as what is taxable at which rate. As Mukesh mentioned, you have 3 recommendations for the rates: 12% rate for the standard, for necessities, 18% for the other goods, the standard rate, and 40% for some luxury automobiles, tobacco, and soft drinks. I'm not sure at this stage what the rate structure will be and how the goods will be classified into the different buckets. The main point is that the weighted average of these 3 rates, according to Arvind Subramanian's own calculations, need not be higher than 15%. In fact, it can be even lower than 15%. So, and that debate is not in the Constitution. I agree with all other speakers that these discussions about the design of the tax don't belong to the Constitution. They belong to the actual GST law. And in that sense, any statements being made about we want to make sure that the tax burden does not go up on the common man, it's motherhood. Which government would want to say that the tax burden on the common man should go up? It's also motherhood that the tax revenues of the state governments should not go down. So my question is that Constitution should move on, amendments should move on, and the government should focus on many of the issues that still remain pending about the actual GST design. And those discussions can only commence once a constitutional amendment is out of the way. And let's hope that...
Absolutely, and you also have to have 50% of the states to ratify that. So there is a big task ahead for the central government. But Mr. Butani, Mr. Podar, Mr. Chandrasekhar, Mr. Pai, and of course, Swami, thank you very much for joining us on this special edition of News First, where we've tracked and brought to you the big breaking news. There seems to be a broad consensus as far as the Empowered Committee on the GST is concerned. Will it be a reality in the monsoon session of Parliament is the billion-dollar question that some of us here at 18 Hour tracking. We take a quick breather, back with Dr. Reddy's top management right here on the channel.